On March 12, 1945, a German general walked into the Reich Chancellery with his cavalry sabre still at his hip and his monocle fixed in his eye. By that point in the war, almost no one argued with Hitler anymore. The man crossing the marble floor was about to do 3 forbidden things in the space of a minute, and then refuse a direct order to his face. He would walk out alive. 8 weeks later, with an aircraft waiting to fly him west, Dietrich von Saucken made a second choice. This time the price was not Hitler's anger, it was 10 years in Soviet captivity. Before the army, there was the easel. As a young man, Dietrich von Saucken spent time at Nidden, an artists' colony on the Curonian Spit, painting in the pale Baltic light. For a while, a life in art seemed possible. In 1910, at 18, he chose differently. Joining an East Prussian grenadier regiment in Königsberg, he was commissioned lieutenant 2 years later. The First World War sent him to defend his own homeland. At Tannenberg in 1914, a German army destroyed an invading Russian force on East Prussian soil, and Saucken was there. He finished the war decorated for bravery and stayed in uniform afterward, through the Freikorps and the small post-war Reichswehr. One posting would matter more than he knew. From 1927, he served on assignment in the Soviet Union, where Germany's and Russia's outcast armies quietly trained together, and he learned the language. 20 years later, it would follow him into a prison cell. The war he is remembered for found him in tanks. He led an armoured brigade into the Soviet Union in 1941, and that winter he was badly wounded, commanding the 4th Panzer Division outside Moscow. He returned to the Knight's Cross in January 1942, and the next year fought at Kursk. By 1944, the German front in the east was coming apart. When the Soviet summer offensive shattered Army Group Center, Saucken pulled the survivors of broken units into a battle group under his own name and held open a crossing over the Berezina River, keeping an escape route alive for soldiers who would otherwise have been cut off. It was the act that fixed his reputation, a commander who spent his energy getting his men out. That instinct to protect the men in front of him, whatever the map in Berlin demanded, was about to put him on a collision course with the people who gave the orders. The province where Dietrich von Saucken was born did not fall slowly. On January 13, 1945, the Red Army opened its offensive into East Prussia. 10 days later, Soviet troops reached the Baltic coast near Elbing and cut the land corridor to the west. The oldest German territory in the east was sealed off, and the people inside it had one way out: the sea. What followed became one of the largest seaborne evacuations in history. On the orders of Admiral Karl Dönitz, the German Navy launched Operation Hannibal, pulling together liners, freighters, ferries, and fishing boats, anything that could float. Over the next 4 months, more than 1 million troops and civilians were carried across the Baltic to the west. The ships sailed through ice and winter storms, under near constant attack from Soviet submarines and aircraft. To reach them, refugees first had to cross the frozen Vistula Lagoon on foot to the harbours at Danzig and Gottenhafen. For Saucken, this was no abstract problem. It was the collapse of the world he had come from. The crisis had been made worse by Berlin. For years, the regime had treated any talk of evacuating the eastern provinces as defeatism, and party officials blocked early plans to move civilians out. When the order finally came, it came too late, and families fled in the depth of winter, with the Red Army already on the roads behind them. Hitler's answer to the collapse was to demand that cities be held as fortresses to the last man, and on March 19th, he ordered the destruction of what infrastructure remained. Into this, in March 1945, Saucken was sent to command the Second Army in West Prussia. No one believed the province could be saved. His task was narrower: hold the shrinking bridgeheads around Danzig and the Vistula Delta long enough for the ships to keep loading. Every day his men held the line was another day the evacuation could continue. He was defending a homeland he would never see again. By some accounts, his eldest son had already been killed at the front the year before. Before he could take up the command, he had to travel to Berlin and receive his orders from Hitler in person. Attached to those orders was a condition Saucken had no intention of accepting. Saucken almost did not get the command at all. A month earlier, Guderian, the army's chief of staff, had shelved him after the two argued over the futility of fighting a war already lost. Yet Guderian rated him among his finest soldiers. In his memoirs, he wrote that von Saucken's fighting retreat was such that only the pen of a new Xenophon could do it justice. The general he had sidelined was recalled within weeks. On March 12, 1945, Saucken reported to the Reichschancellery in Berlin. What happened there comes mainly from Gerhard Bolt. one of Guderian's aides who was present, and from the historian Anthony Beevor, who relayed Bolt's account. By Bolt's telling, Saucken broke the rules before he said a word. He kept one hand resting on his cavalry saber and did not surrender the weapon at the door. He gave a military salute rather than the raised arm Hitler salute that had been compulsory for officers since the July 1944 plot. He kept his monocle in his eye, and when he greeted Hitler, he offered only the slightest bow. Around Hitler, each gesture was understood for what it was: contempt. Guderian and Martin Bormann, also in the room, reportedly froze. Then came the order. Hitler told Saucken that in his new command he would take his instructions from Albert Forster, the Gauleiter of Danzig, a party administrator with no military rank. For a Prussian career officer, being placed under a regional party boss was the deeper insult. Saucken is said to have struck the marble map table with the flat of his hand and answered, "I have no intention, Herr Hitler, of placing myself under the orders of a Gauleiter." He had contradicted Hitler directly, and he had called him Herr Hitler rather than Mein Führer. By 1945, contradicting Hitler to his face could end a career, or worse. Instead, the reported reply was a climb down. "All right, Saucken, keep the command yourself," Hitler said. He dismissed the general without a handshake, and Saucken left with a faint bow he had entered with. Not every witness accepted the story. Heinz Linger, Hitler's valet, later dismissed the most theatrical details as implausible and noted that Saucken was regarded as a loyal commander, not a rebel. That caution matters. He had served Hitler's war to the end. What set him apart was not political opposition, but an older code of military duty that still placed his men above his own escape. He flew to Danzig the next day and threw himself into the defense. He now commanded a battle that was already lost. What he did with it would define him more than the scene in the Chancellery. Through April 1945, Saucken's command was renamed Army East Prussia and pushed back into the Vistula Delta, a shrinking pocket on the Baltic coast. The wider war was ending. Berlin fell, Hitler was dead, and on May 8th, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. Saucken's men were still holding their ground on the Hel Peninsula, a thin spit of land in the sea, covering the last ships of the evacuation. That same day, word reached him that he had been awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. It was one of the highest grades of the Knight's Cross, Germany's top military decoration, and only 27 men ever received it. Saucken was the 27th. The award came through at the very end of the war, making him the last soldier to receive it. The decoration meant little by then. What mattered was the aircraft. By early May, the pocket was nearly cut off, the Red Army closing in by land. A plane stood ready to fly him west into the part of Germany the Western Allies would occupy, where surrender meant a camp and, in time, release. Other senior officers were being flown out. The seat was his if he wanted it. Saucken refused the seat. He had built his name on the opposite instinct. At the Berezina in 1944, he had held the crossing open so trapped soldiers could escape. Through the spring of 1945, his army had held the bridgehead so the ships could carry more than 1 million people across the Baltic. To fly out alone now, while the men who had done the fighting went into Soviet captivity, would have undone everything that record stood for. On May 9, 1945, one day after the German surrender, Dietrich von Saucken laid down his command on the Hel Peninsula and gave himself up to the Red Army alongside his men. He was a general who spoke Russian, who had trained in the Soviet Union, and who had just turned down the plane that could have saved him. None of it would help him now. Ahead lay the Soviet prison system and 10 years of captivity. Saucken disappeared into the Soviet prison system. He was first held in the Lubyanka in Moscow, then in Oryol prison, and in 1949 he was moved to a labor camp at Taishet in Siberia. That same year, a Soviet military court convicted him as a war criminal and sentenced him to 25 years. According to later accounts, he was kept in solitary confinement and pressed to sign a confession he refused to put his name to. The interrogations and the years of hard labor broke his body. By the time he was released, he could no longer walk without a wheelchair, and he would remain in one for the rest of his life. His release came in 1955. That autumn, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow and negotiated the return of the last German prisoners still held in the Soviet Union, a decade after the war had ended. Saucken was among them. He settled in Pullach near Munich and lived out of public view. The man who had faced down Hitler in the Chancellery was, by then, a name almost no one remembered. In Pullach, Dietrich von Saucken went back to the thing he had set aside in 1910. He took up his brushes again and spent his last years painting. The career he had once traded for the army, finally his to keep. He died there on September 27, 1980, at the age of 88, and was buried in Munich. The boy from the Baltic who became a general and then a prisoner ended as what he had first set out to be, an artist. Dietrich von Saucken's story did not end in triumph. It ended quietly, far from the maps, the uniforms, and the collapsing world he had once served. If you found this story insightful, watch Otto Carius from Tiger Tank Ace to Village Pharmacist next. And if you want more forgotten stories from the Second World War, subscribe to History Inside. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.